At the core of psychology lies a simple but radical question. How do higher mental functions, speech, memory, thinking, actually come into being? Are they just more complex sensations, or are they something fundamentally different in nature? This question split psychology from the very beginning, and it brings us to two major figures who represent two radically different concepts: Wilhelm Wundt and Lev Vygotsky. Today we'll look at 5 key differences between their theories, and by the end of this video you will know why Vygotsky thought that classical psychology had reached its dead end and what revolutionary solution he had to offer. Wilhelm Wundt, the father of psychology, wanted to study consciousness, and he was determined to do it experimentally. For doing that, he opened the world's first psychological laboratory in Leipzig in 1879. And there, he wanted to study the structure of consciousness by breaking it down into elements such as sensations and perceptions. However, he soon came to the conclusion that only elementary processes such as sensations and perceptions can be studied experimentally, while higher mental functions, including thinking, speech, memory, cannot be studied experimentally without losing their psychological nature. Therefore, Wundt excluded them from experimental psychology and assigned their study to a separate discipline, which he called Völkerpsychologie, psychology of peoples. Thus, Wundt proposed a strict division. Elementary processes belong to experimental psychology, while higher mental processes belong to historical and comparative analysis. Vygotsky turned this logic upside down. For him, higher mental processes are not a peripheral topic. They are the very core of psychology. A psychology that only describes higher mental functions without explaining how they actually emerge abandons its scientific task. So Vygotsky argued that higher mental functions can and should be studied. However, a totally different method is needed for that. For Wundt, psychology was a study of immediate conscious experience. Its task was to study the structure of consciousness by breaking it down into basic elements and their combinations. To achieve this, Wundt used the method of experimental introspection with adult individuals. Vygotsky emphasized the social origins of mind. He insisted that higher mental functions are not built on top of elementary processes, like a second floor is built over the first. For him, higher mental functions are not the result of more elements, but of a qualitative reorganization of mental activity mediated by science, language, and social relations. Thus, instead of measuring mature mental functions, Vygotsky focused on reconstructing how they actually come into being, that is, on their genesis. For him, the genetic experiment becomes the tool for creating conditions under which higher mental functions emerge. This shift placed a child, rather than the adult, at the very center of psychological science. For Wundt, language is a product of collective history. It grows out of shared traditions and reflects how a community already thinks. Language expresses its collective mindset, but it doesn't actively shape individual cognition. So the individual mind develops largely on its own, while language serves a means of its outward expression. For Vygotsky, language plays a fundamentally different role. It is a psychological tool that actively shapes thinking. Speech first works outward, coordinating the behavior of others. Then it turns inward, guiding one's own actions. And then it becomes internalized as inner speech. Here, thinking itself is organized through language. Now imagine a child learning to write. For Wundt, writing is a part of culture, a script handed down through history. The child learns the shapes and the rules, but thinking itself flows independently. For Vygotsky, it's different. An adult guides the hand, naming the letters out loud. The child whispers them to themselves. Eventually, the voice disappears. Writing becomes inner speech, the tool that shapes thought. For Wundt, Culture functions as a background of meanings, traditions, and collective experience. It expresses the spirit of people, the Volksgeist, and provides a common framework within which individuals think and communicate. But this cultural world remains largely external to the inner mechanisms of psychological development. Thus, culture surrounds the individual. It gives content to thought, but it doesn't reorganize how thinking itself works. For Vygotsky, culture is not a backdrop, but an active force in development. Through social interactions, individuals take up cultural tools, language, symbols, norms, practices, and make them their own. These tools are gradually internalized and become part of the higher mental processes. In this view, culture doesn't merely influence thinking from the outside. It helps build the mind from within. So, at the deepest level, Wundt and Vygotsky disagreed on what it means to explain the mind. Wundt believed that psychology could explain elementary processes through experiment. But when it came to higher mental phenomena, it had to give way to description. Thinking, speech, and culture were to be documented historically, compared across peoples, and classified, but not causally reconstructed. For Vygotsky, this was precisely the problem. He argued that explanation must be genetic. For him, to explain a psychological function meant to reconstruct its origin, its development, and its transformation, from social interaction to internal mental structure. Only by tracing this developmental path can psychology move beyond surface description to a genuine causal account of human mind. So, these 5 differences show that Wundt and Vygotsky represent 2 fundamentally different visions of psychology. Wundt built a psychology of analysis and classification, powerful in its methods, but limited to what could be immediately observed and measured. Vygotsky proposed a psychology of development and explanation, one that placed language, culture, and social interactions at the very center of the human mind. And in doing so, Vygotsky argued that classical psychology had reached a dead end, and that only a new cultural historical approach could explain what makes human consciousness uniquely human. If this video was helpful, like it and follow for more.